With this, let me actually get started and do a quick introduction of Rebecca Henderson. Those that don't know her, I quite frankly didn't know her until she released the famous book. I took the freedom to put it up here in my little library, Reimagining Capitalism in a World in Fire. Now, we titled the videocast differently, talking about love and power in the firm. And I discovered after reaching out to Rebecca, I think maybe 2 months ago, 3 months ago, that there's a lot more to her work than reimagining capitalism, which has a bit of a macro view, that she's very concerned about what happens inside the firms, some ethical and spiritual crisis, etc. So we got to get into really the weeds of high road firms, low road firms. She'll probably quickly explain what she means and what she has observed out there. Quick introduction, as much as little as is still needed. Taking out my notes here. So she is one of 25 Harvard professors for, is it business, is it economics, or is it both together, just in the business faculty of Harvard? Obviously, this is a very elite club. I always like to think about it, and we'll have a question related to it. Now, she has more than 25 years, ample experience on doing research, doing publications, speaking, writing the book, etc. So very deep level of experience. And she explores the degree to which the private sector can play a major role in building a more sustainable economy, which is exactly the topic we will address here. Now, I did already quoted the book, which will kind of you touch on in the beginning as well. It's unavoidable and has some very interesting revelations, I think, clearly outlined. And as well, she's very much interested at working at the frontier of personal transformation and how it leads into systematic change. Now, having said all that, let me open with, in the book, and again, this is not a book review, but I will refer to it at some point in time because I think it will provide some interesting macro perspective into what we're going to talk about. You open the chapter 1, I think, actually was asking the simple question, what is capitalism? And while we could fill probably hours of discourse, we could, I would like to actually add then, in which way is your perception and view on capitalism that it is flawed? And in which way do you think what capitalism should be? As brief as you can, so people get a macro frame on what capitalistic flaws there are and what capitalism could and should be.
Sure. So, Constantine, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. And thank you for being aware that the question you have asked me could take hours and hours of discussion, and I'm going to try and answer in 3 minutes. So my apologies to everyone on the call who knows a ton about this, because I'm going to generalize like crazy. So what is capitalism? In general, I think of capitalism as an economic system run largely by markets rather than the state, in which most economic assets are owned by private citizens rather than the state. That said, there are, and as you know, there are books written on this, there are many varieties of capitalism. So we can think all the way from Japanese capitalism to German capitalism to Chinese state capitalism to all-out extractive capitalism as we're seeing it in the United States right now. And I think of those systems as each of them embodying a different mixture, how much state and how much market. Right? So, Chinese capitalism is a lot of state, but they leave privately owned firms to compete with each other, but under really quite tight regulatory and political constraints. Similarly, in Scandinavia, the capitalism, and I'm generalizing horribly, is more or less constrained by a very strong social contract that says private firms are in service to the society. You could argue this is in place in Japan too, to some degree. So that, yes, we compete with each other, but we understand that firms' role is to generate prosperity and jobs and the health of the society. And then as you get less and less state and less society, you get to a kind of capitalism which says that no, it's all about the free markets. We want absolutely minimal regulation. And in the extreme, no regulation at all. And one of the things I go after in my book is I think there is a kind of capitalism which is sort of in the middle. And I'll just give a couple of examples to give
Please.
you a sense of what I mean. One is if you have a kind of capitalism where there are no controls on, for example, environmental pollution. So you can throw up a factory, you can dump all your waste in the river, and let's just make this a little more colorful. You can drive working conditions in your plant to the absolute minimum. You break unions, and just for fun, you buy out the government. That to me is not about a free market. That is a badly out of balance system where the social goods, clean rivers, decent jobs, a democratic system that at least makes an attempt to try and represent the will of most people, is in balance with a free market. And I make the argument in the book that even as a business person, you should care about that balance. Because, and I think it's always important to say this, capitalism at its best is incredibly innovative, really dynamic. I mean, GDP per head has quintupled over the last 50 years or so, which is extraordinary at a time when world population has tripled. I mean, we are living in a world which our grandparents, I think, could mostly not dream of, with, for those of us fortunate enough to enjoy it, access to food and safety and expression, which is really unparalleled in human history. And as I'm sure many of you are familiar with the book Factfulness, as the author of that book points out, these benefits go a long way down the income distribution. China brought 1 billion people out of poverty. How? Through capitalism. So, as I talk about a balanced, controlled capitalism, I don't mean to suggest that we should get rid of free markets. I have students and colleagues across Harvard who say, you know, capitalism is broken, we should just get rid of it, we should throw it out the window. I do not believe that. I think what we're talking about is constraining, controlling, building a capitalism that is in service to human flourishing rather than in service only to the short-term bottom line for a very small group of people.
I'm going to actually follow up exactly where you stopped. The short-term mindedness, bottom line kind of focus, which is all driven about finance. Now, in your book, and I'll promise everybody, this is not a book review, and we're going to go from macro into micro at some point, at some point indeed. What this audience, I think most people will actually perceive is that, well, the system is flawed, capitalism is flawed, and a lot of it is for one reason, which you address center on in your book, which is for finance. So with this obsession on short term, specifically for stock quoted companies, there's even more obvious, but even private equity or private owned companies, this single minded obsession and the dominance of the finance rule on businesses, that seems to be a huge bottleneck in many opinions. Give us your very detailed view, or at least in the book, you reach out to some specifics on how this can be realistically be addressed. Again, this is not about whining and agreeing that there's a problem. People here do agree. We're talking to the choir. How do you think this could actually realistically be addressed, this being perceived as such a major hindrance to a more equitable, fair capitalism?
So I think there are many possible solutions, and we will need many of them.
Okay.
So my first response is, in many situations, focusing only on the short term and the bottom line is bad for business. And we have developed a financial infrastructure. When I say we, I'm talking principally of Anglo-American capitalism. But we've developed a financial infrastructure where many analysts and investors, or not the primary investors, but the people who manage the money, are paid on short-term returns. and they're using tools that are continually pushing for short-term returns. And I think we have a fair amount of evidence that actually focusing on the longer term is in many cases better for business. I'm sure many people here on the call are aware of the track record of some of the particularly well managed large family run firms, some of the firms that are run as trusts, that the long term focus can at least not do worse and can often do better than the short-term focus. And so one thing I think we need to start working on is learning to communicate that better and documenting it more effectively. I'm thinking of efforts like the Long-Term Capital Foundation, which brought together CEOs and analysts to really give a CEO real time to explain the strategy, to explain why long-term investments make sense, to communicate to the financial markets. That may sound like a small thing, but I have more than 20 years experience on major corporate boards, including a Fortune 200. And in my own experience, I speak only for myself, our investors often did not understand the fundamental strategy of the company or the importance of long-term investments. So I think there's a very deep educational thing we could do here. Secondly, we could, as I pointed to, and many of you will be familiar with this idea, change the ownership structure of companies. We could make it much easier to make firms employee owned, to be in long-term trusts. We could change the way we think about governance so that it's very clear that the duty of the firm is to maximize welfare of the community in which it's located, and directors cannot be sued for making trade-offs consistent with that. There are downsides to all of these solutions, but that's a real possibility. We could try to persuade financial investors that they have a long-term interest in the stability of the whole economic system, and that the kinds of actions that firms are taking now to drive short-term returns are likely to destabilize not only the Earth's climate and ecosystems, but also the political and social structures. And, I guess I bet there are some other people on the call who felt this. When Larry Fink at
Mm,
BlackRock started talking about the need for firms to have a purpose,
I
that the goal
remember
of
that.
the firm is long-term flourishing and profits are a means to an end, not an end in itself. I thought that was the beginning of the large investors realizing that we need this different kind of approach to the market. Um, but those are some solutions. All of them have, downsides and issues, but I think they're all worth trying.
I'd like to actually share a story, and if I get it wrong, let me know, because it's a story that you shared in a different podcast that speaking about there's ample data that shows that long-termism is at least not worse, there may be exceptions, and often even better. And in that podcast, you quote there's up to 300, there may be more by now, real tangible business cases in Harvard alone showing that sustainable management, systemic management, actually long-term view is actually more beneficial. At the same time, you mentioned, and this is a little story that I'm sharing with people because you shared it publicly already, after you revealed your book, which has a lot of truism in it, you actually had a lot of audience, many people listened, but you mentioned that it became quickly frustrating on how little tangible action followed that. So my curiosity was, and I actually relate to then you being at Harvard, which is, it doesn't get more respected and reputational than Harvard. So people should listen and take in what is a fact, what is true. It strikes me that there's so much resistance or little adaptation of what is actually well documented, well researched, well told. What do you see as the main stopping blocks, hindrances in companies, actually in people's minds, maybe in leaders' minds?
So, firstly, the research to which I was referring in particular is the research looking at the difference between so-called high road firms, firms that treat employees with dignity and respect, and decenter power and focus on purpose and meaning, versus so-called low-road firms, which tend to manage people like things and focus on the numbers, and it's all about the short term. And I do indeed think we have very good data suggesting you can run a high-road firm, and at the very least, you will not underperform your low-road competitors. Not that that's
You
easy.
can you maybe elaborate a little bit a little bit more? I was just thinking on what a high road firm is, so people have a better idea. What are the ingredients you have observed that
Ah,
make a company a high road company?
sure. Sure. So, for those of you who may not know this literature, and if you're interested, I'd be happy to recommend some ways into it. There's a long literature looking at so-called high commitment work practices. So, these are firms that support high levels of communication within their workforce, that promote on the merits, that really work to build trust and purpose inside the firm. And what we see in the data, which is absolutely fascinating, is that in the average industry, the top 10% most productive firms are more than twice as productive as the bottom 10% set of firms. And there's a number of reasons for that difference, but it's overwhelmingly correlated with the adoption of these high road work practices. And that raises immediately the question. I mean, the data is very strong. We've seen it in industry after industry and multiple geographies. And there are a couple of economists who I think will win the Nobel Prize for this work. It's very important. And I spent, you may have heard me say this, but I spent 20 years in windowless conference rooms with other economists trying to make these results go away because they're so counterintuitive to economists. And the answer lies in, management matters. I mean, it really matters. And then you go right to Konstantin's question, which, Konstantin, I have been obsessed with this question for years now. So let me give you some sense of why I think it's difficult to change. The first reason is it takes time. So it's related to the time horizon problem. I'm sure many of you are aware of the worse before better problem. It's let's try this. You will feel much better if you go to the gym every day. But the first 2 months you go to the gym every day, you will feel worse because you've disrupted your schedule and your legs hurt and it's difficult. And so transforming a firm, and Zeynep Ton at MIT um, in her initiative, the Good Jobs Institute has documented this in some detail. Running one of these high road firms is not a matter of clicking your fingers and announcing we're going to do it. It requires the redesign of work so that when you empower people, they have decisions that they can make that will make a difference. It requires changing your hiring practices, your incentives, the ways you promote, the ways you organize, and it requires constant reinforcement. And I believe it's hard to tease this out of the data, but I really believe it, that to do this requires management that is more interested in building a great firm and creating great impact than it is in making enormous amounts of money, that is emotionally committed to having a real purpose and a real meaning, which could be just generating great jobs right here or in selling really good quality food. I mean, these are old-fashioned ideas, but back in the 50s and 60s, lots of people ran firms this way. But what this requires, Constantine, is not only that you explain to your board why the change is going to take time, it's going to take longer than a year, and in the short term, you're going to be training and investing, and it's going to take a while, but it also requires the emotional strength and stability and the sense of purpose to bring the firm with you, to build the kind of collective understanding of what's required. I had the great pleasure of working with Paul Polman at Unilever, where he first took over as CEO, and he
Yeah.
invited me to facilitate his strategic retreats, the first few strategic retreats. And one of the things that Paul could do, and I've since seen this in many leaders who do this well, is he could, from at one moment, talk absolutely from the heart about what Unilever could do in the world and the millions of people it touched and why it could really transform global supply chains. And the next moment, he would turn to someone in the room and say, David, the results from the Indonesian deodorant business are absolutely not up to scratch. So you need people who are superb operators. I think in many ways, running a firm this way is harder. So superb operators really can talk to the finance markets, really know how to run the firm, and have this deeply rooted sense of what they want to do and why it's important, and can resist the temptation, because I think it's a huge temptation of managing people as if they were things with whom you did not have to have a relationship or any kind of emotional complication. It's so much easier, and I only speak for myself, and I try not to do this, but sometimes when I'm in meetings, I'm like, I know the answer. Would you just do what I say, please? You know, this kind of temptation to think that we alone can cognitively get to the answer and we don't want to deal with the messy human stuff.
Mm.
That's a very human thing. And I think, alas, we are selecting for business leaders who would rather manage that way than manage in the more old-fashioned, embedded, loving, connected, right there kind of way that running a high road firm requires.
Let me double click on one thing that you said, because I think that gets us to the heart, certainly, of the love piece in Love and Power and the Firm, which is the emotional and ethical commitment of a leader. You mentioned the example of Paul Pullman. There may be other examples that you want to share. Let's double click and explore a little bit. What do you really mean by emotional commitment? The one word I heard out of what you said was purpose. Is purpose sufficient? But something else you said is taking the company along. So it's not sufficient to be your purpose. You have to pervade it, and you have to actually get the company to come along and make it their purpose too. Explore us, given this seems to be such a fine and subtle importance, on what practices you have seen of people doing exactly that, building emotional and ethical commitment. What are specific practices you have seen?
So I've just finished writing a case about a firm called Ashley Stewart, which at the time of the case, and still is, was a suburban US retailer selling plus-sized clothes to African American women. And at the time of the case, the firm had been run by private equity buyers, essentially running the firm into the ground. Run it by the numbers, just get the inventory turn up. It's just a thing. The people on the ground are just people. Just make the numbers,
Mm.
make the numbers, make the numbers. Really badly run. And the protagonist of the case is a man called James Rhee, who spent his career in private equity. A child of first generation Korean immigrants. And, he likes to joke that he was the, epitomized private equity guy, the jets, the money, the cars, the whole thing. And it began to seem, increasingly hollow. And he began to wonder, as people do, what am I doing with my life? And he agreed to take over this firm, Ashley Stewart, as it was entering into bankruptcy, try and clean it up, turn it around, get a buyer. And what James found was that this was an amazing business, that the employees in the stores were creating an oasis for Black women, a place for Black women where they could be seen and heard and celebrated, that these weren't just clothes, these were a way of saying, you are just as important, you are a central person in life and building community and trust on the ground. But that the store managers were, managed by the numbers and yelled at, and no one ever really talked to them. And he took the revolutionary step of going to the stores in person, talking to the store managers and asking them what they needed and how he could help. He called it managing with kindness and love. Sorry,
Mhm.
kindness and math.
Kindness
So, kindness and mathematics.
and
So,
math. Okay, thank you. I didn't expect that. And math.
yeah,
Okay, thank you.
kindness and math. And the kindness was, okay, we are going to think about this business not as selling as many cheap clothes as we can, but as about celebrating, supporting, and doing everything we can for our customer. And I am going to manage the firm as if everyone who works for me is part of that and is deeply excited about it, which is true. And I am going to listen to them. And we are going to really double down on trust and enthusiasm and commitment. And we're going to throw out classical accounting. And we're going to do what he called lemonade stand accounting. And he showed everyone in the firm all the numbers. He said this is all about building goodwill and trust. Those are the most important assets. We're going to do that. And then he started to take concrete actions to make that real. So, for example, the lighting in the stores was terrible. It was kind of orange, flickering, cheap neon tubes. So he spent several $1 million to put in high quality LED lights. Why? Because the women in the stores, they're all run by women, were falling off the ladders as they changed these substandard, constantly flickering light bulbs. So he had a huge safety problem. People were hurting themselves. So he changed the light bulbs. He didn't want his employees to get hurt. What did that do? Well, first, it signals to everyone in the stores that this manager is different. He's in the stores, he cares, he's taking our health seriously. And, surprise, it lit up the merchandise. It made the stores much more attractive, welcoming places to be. So women started coming in, leaving their kids, agreeing to meet their friends there. And then the store managers said, well, if you gave us cheap cameras and a backdrop, we could take pictures of the women in the clothes in front of the backdrops,
Oh.
and we could show them how beautiful they are. And they started a social media campaign on the ground from the stores. Social media sales took off like a rocket. So he built deep kindness. There's a wonderful moment. He wrote a book about this called Red Helicopter, which I highly, highly recommend. There's one wonderful moment when his father died. And he was kind of a button-down private equity guy. And so he didn't tell anyone at the firm. He just said, okay, I'm going to take a few days off, a few days vacation. And some of the store managers came to his assistant and said, well, where's James? Where he's gone? Where is he gone? How come he just disappeared? And so his assistant told them that his father's dead and he's at the funeral. So James tells this story. He's standing in the funeral home and 25 fashionably dressed black women show up. And he's like, what just happened? And one of them gets to the front of the line and she says, James, we're your friends, Friends show up for each other at moments like this. And she told me that he sat next to her and held her hand and cried. Kindness and math, right? So why can't we run organizations like this? I mean, James is a fantastic operator, but the heart of what he did was listen to the people on the ground and open himself up to not throw his weight around, but to listen and to care. And I have seen that in many firms. This is not an impossible dream. This is what so many people are yearning for. I mean, Raj has written several books about firms like this, and I'm sure other people on the call have.
Indeed.
Yeah. So I think what's so critical here is to legitimize this, to measure it, to write the stories, to tell the stories, and also, and maybe I'm segueing to where you might want to go, Constantine, I've got very interested in individual transformation and individual practice. Because I think if you're stuck inside yourself, if you're running really hard, if you're panicked, if you're climbing, if you're trying to fit in, all of this, the dominant kind of gestalt of modern culture, particularly in business, is working against what we're talking about. And so you need to help support people find a way to open these doors for themselves.
Before we double click on the transformational, the inner road for outer results, before we go there, I want to quickly shed some light on the other side of the title, love and power. Now, you clearly articulated, you called it kindness and math, and at some other point, I'm quoting, you're calling leaders to combine analytical rigor, just in the same ballpark, with deeper human capabilities such as empathy, connection, purpose, and moral courage. So it definitely is both. Elaborate a little bit on this idea of power, which has a different connotation for many people. It's beyond the rigor and the math and the being a superb operator, as you called it 5 minutes ago. This has a little bit of a negative touch. Power is often abused, is used for its own purpose. So when you relate to both of it, do you see them as a part of a polarity? Or what do you understand by the power aspect, and how does it
Oh,
supposed to be
goodness.
combined with love?
So, Constantine, I'm still trying to work this through, right? So, everyone on the call, these are just some preliminary thoughts about this, such a deep fundamental.
Beautiful.
So here's how I'm thinking about it. So I started by thinking, okay, we need more love, we need more kindness, we need more grounding in our deepest self, in the best part of ourselves, in the part of ourselves that knows it's not about the endless accumulation of stuff and status. It's about making a difference in the world and being in relationship with others. So let's call that love. And of course, you could many, many definitions, but for purposes, let's call that love. And let's talk about building relationality. Let's talk about building a really good relationship with yourself, which, and I speak for myself, many people don't have sometimes, and also relationships with others. And let's build love. And so you say that, and if you're me, like students show up in your class and they're like, yeah, let's do the love. The love is great. And then we're reminded of Dr. King's saying, which was a variant of what Tillich said, which is love alone, love without power is sentimental and anemic.
Okay.
So if we just think that, and I wish I could do this, if I just snap my fingers and everyone is, deeply rooted in themselves and alive and full of compassion and has an open heart, and then we put them right back into existing structures. Like we don't change the nature of pushing for shareholder returns, and we don't change the accounting measures, and we don't change the incentives. We are nowhere, right? Because the structures reinforce the negative behavior. So when I think about power, I mean a number of things. One is really pointing to the fact that sometimes we think power is dirty. We think power is corrupt. I say power and everyone goes to, nah, I don't want it. But power can be generative, right? Power is about creation. Power is about building things and taking care of the people we love. So power is complicated and it has many positive sides. And then I don't think we can create a world built on love, oriented to human flourishing, without changing the nature of our institutions and how we think about power, without creating firms that are explicitly designed to reinforce and create and support people in growing in depth and compassion and kindness. And, at Unilever, that meant putting everyone through purpose workshops. It means, I'm sure many of you are aware of the inner development goals. It can mean systematically helping people discover ways to calm themselves down, to self-regulate, to be more aware of what others are thinking. I mean, there's a whole enormous field of psychology and human development that I'm pointing to here. But essentially, I'm imagining in a world in which humans grow up in the kind of classic adult development sense. We stop thinking only about ourselves and realize it's much more skillful to think about others and to build a good society. But our institutions grow up to support that. And, where my work is at present is, well, that's very interesting, Rebecca, but what kinds of examples? And I can give you examples in business. I'm learning about examples in education, in politics. I'm beginning to think about what does that mean for how we think about the democracy, for the nature of civic life. A lot of data suggesting that we need to love the state of which we're a part. Whoa, what does that mean? That if I'm not committed to the idea of a common enterprise, we won't be able to sustain the democracy. So I'm just throwing out examples of why I think it's so important to think about the interaction between love and power.
You make an interesting observation. I think it's in your book, or may have caught it somewhere else, about architectural innovation. And you touch on so many aspects, which makes it so powerful listening to you at the macro and the micro level, and then actually going into a very personal transformation as well. I don't know if this is a good time. You can calibrate yourself if this architectural innovation is a good theme to introduce people here to. It seems to me, when I read about it, there was an important ingredient to actually get a path out of what you observe.
So thank you for asking, Konstantin. One of the reasons I'm glad you asked is the paper that is, I wrote a paper many, many years ago. It was the second paper I wrote called Architectural Innovation and the Failure of Established Firms. And I'm sure this is not true for any of you, but for me, it's still my most highly cited paper, which is always a little sobering, like, good paper, Rebecca, well, the rest are okay. Um, but I do think that the idea is directly relevant. So let me, and forgive me, those of you who know the concept well, the basic idea is that in our modern society, we have divided most problems into tiny pieces and assigned people to those pieces. So, for example, I was doing a lot of work with the automotive companies at the time I wrote the paper, and they had door handle engineers. So there were people, I don't know if there still are, there were people who did nothing but design door handles. They went to door handle conferences, they read door handle magazines. For them, the door handle was where it was at when they thought about a car. And everybody else was divided up into similarly highly fragmented knowledge. And what that meant is that there were two kinds of knowledge going on in the firm. One was component knowledge, which was knowledge of the piece of the problem right here. And typically, a successful firm, one of the reasons they're successful is because they have this enormous component knowledge. And then there's architectural knowledge, which is knowledge of what it is that everyone else is doing. And most people have a kind of model of what everyone else is doing that is simplified but good enough most of the time.
Hmm.
But what happens when the system starts shifting? And of course, many of us, myself included, are waking up to the importance of systems thinking and what that means. And it can be kind of vague what it really means. But for me, one of the things it means is when everything starts changing at once and the very structure of the car changes. So, most obviously, you pull out the internal combustion engine and you put in a battery. It looks like you've made a simple change, but no. You've actually changed the whole shape of what a car might be and how you run it and what it's optimized for. That creates all kinds of problems because our door handle engineers don't know, like they know door handles. And suddenly you're telling them, well, this changes everything. And they're like, does it change the door handle? So I think we have that problem not only within firms, and of course, AI is going to shake this up big time, but I think we have it as a societal level, which is those of us who have led fortunate and privileged lives, pick me, we have thought that I could just like do my job and everything would be okay. And in a way, one way to interpret Milton Friedman is he gave many business people license to think that as long as they maximize profit, that was all they needed to do. That's a classic architectural assumption. I don't need to know what's happening in politics. I don't need to know what's happening in climate science. I just put my head down and I maximize profits. And then we got an architectural shift, which is suddenly there are no rules, basically. I'm exaggerating, but there are no rules. Business can do anything. They can invest in elections, they can buy governments, they can dump anything they want into the river, they don't care about worker well-being. Whoa. And suddenly the whole architecture in which we're operating has shifted. And that's part of what's happening. And then the other part of what's happening, I'll say one more thing and stop, is this whole thinking in compartments is part of, I think, overvaluing the rational and the material and undervaluing the alive, the connected, the important stuff we can't see, just as happiness, joy, or like what I can't measure them. I can't measure them. I don't know how to put them down. And so we have a kind of massive civilizational, this is really grandiose, a kind of civilizational architectural problem, which is we built a system that is amazing at generating more stuff, and that is great, but not so good at thinking about all the second order effects, which are now coming to be first order effects. You know, our children killing themselves, the planet falling apart, all that stuff.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
we find is not really important. And that's an architectural problem. Yeah.
Well, I love not only from the content aspect what you're saying, I found it very interesting. Thanks for sharing it. Because while you yourself called it grandiose, what I think is interesting in your work, and there may be people here that relate to it, and yet, as this is a big picture question, and the architectural connection among things is so key to addressing the problem, it starts with everybody within. And you make that very clear in many of your papers and other conversations that I've seen, this inner transformation. Maybe you can actually go from big macro down to the individual, the leader, if you want. What kind of, why is it so indispensable to have this inner journey, inner transformation? I think at one point in time you call it inner transformation for outer results. So it starts there. You're very explicit, and this is very appreciated in this kind of community. Explore a bit later why this is so important, and maybe you have some specific things that you relate to an inner journey, because it obviously can relate to so many things for so many different people.
Sure. So, so let me begin by getting a little bit personal, and my apologies to those of you who've heard this
Thank you.
story. Um, when my book Reimagining Capitalism on Fire was published, it came out in April of 2020 at the height of COVID. And I thought it would disappear without a trace, but many people were online. I mean, I don't know if you remember back then, but people were like excited about doing Zooms.
Yeah.
And so I was very fortunate. The book really took off. It went into 7 languages. I ended up giving talks all over the world. It was on the bestseller list, like the real bestseller list in South Korea and Japan. Very well received in South America, in Africa. I mean, it was amazing. And I gave all these talks. And it was like a dream come true. I was, yeah,
Mm.
that's fantastic. But it became very clear to me as I gave these talks that most of the people was talking to were not going to do anything. And you've touched on that earlier, Constantine, and I've talked about, why I think that is. But what happened is as a result of that experience, I got not clinically depressed. I was getting out of bed in the morning and, was fine with my family and so on and eating and so on. But I felt I could see this wall of suffering coming towards us. And I just found myself thinking, well, we're going to go down. I mean,
Hmm.
it's going to be mass suffering. The society's going to break open. There's going to be waves of, the food supply is going to fail and the energy systems and the transportation systems. And I just got so sad. I just got fundamentally sad. And I started going on silent retreat. So I happened to be a Buddhist, but I hadn't really taken it all that seriously. But I started going on meditation retreats for a week a month, which I wouldn't recommend for everyone. My husband is like, no, that is crazy. But but for me, that was a way to really like, how do I even begin to handle what is happening? I've done climate change for 20 years. 20 years ago, I thought we were going to fix it. Now it's clear we're going to go right through 2 degrees. I don't think there's any way around it. And that's really going to be terrible. And how do we hold that? I just wanted to be able to move forward, to do something because I felt so bad. And I started hanging out with psychologists and with people who talk about climate trauma and I learned, and this is so oversimplified that, like, really forgive me, those of you who really know this literature, but really oversimplified. Many, many people, particularly in the developed West, particularly in the kinds of jobs we have and the people we work with, many people spend most of their time in what I would call the red zone. And the red zone is running really hard, very task oriented. I can do it. I can do it. Watch me. Very high performance, but very intense. And, some people, some of us got to where we are because like we were really good in operating in that zone. Pick me. But the trouble with spending too much time in that zone, there are at least a couple of problems with spending too much time in that zone. The most obvious is if you spend too much time there, when you switch off, you go to the gray zone or the blue zone, which is you numb out. You're so overwhelmed, you feel so unsupported, you're always performing, you're always trying to, show off and do your best and be the person. And that's very, very tiring. And there's not much love in it, and there's not much connection, there's not much support. So you fall into this gray blue zone. You numb out. Me, I read, science fiction novels or watch Netflix reruns or, the kind of stuff you do. But if you live your life oscillating between those two zones, there's a number of problems. One is it's very hard to see the world differently. When you're that activated and you're moving that fast, you tend to believe you're right, and you narrow the solution set quite dramatically. And it's also much harder to relate to other people. So this relates to the question of why it's hard to run a high road firm. Because if you're continually on high alert, you don't have mental space or even any time to stop and talk and listen. Because for me, the golden key to, getting out of this state is listening to yourself and others. Because there's another place to be, right? You could call it the green zone, you could call it flow, you could call it true kind of centering. And in that place, you're much more likely to be able to work with others, to hear them, to listen to them. You're much more likely to be able to see the world in ways that generates different kinds of solutions, that's much more open. And you're much more likely to be able to handle what's happening. And so my vision of the world going forward, and I'm afraid it's a little bleak, is that things are going to start to shake. And it's going to feel like we're in a low-grade military conflict, like most of the time. And stuff will go wrong, and there won't be jobs, and everything will be in short supply, and there'll be floods and fires and famines and millions of people migrating, and a lot of anger and a lot of hate. And what do we need in moments like that? We need, and I'm absolutely not the first person to say this, but we need not only leaders who can hold themselves, but leaders who can help build community, connection, the institutions. We could call them islands of coherence. We could call them the imaginal cells, which are the place that's not on fire, which is the demonstration of what it looks like when you lead in a very different way and from a very different place. And I think that's the task. And that's all about, learning to lead from love and not from lack, and learning to lead with joy and not panic. And that requires some degree of inner cultivation, but that can make it sound super individual. I think we know from the great faith traditions and from the psychologists that, in fact, this is best done in groups with peers, with, we could call it a church, we could call it a Sangha, we could call it a discussion group, we could call it a dinner party circle, but you do it together. You do it together. We could call it a purpose-driven firm.
Let me double click on that because we're running,
Sorry, I'm just
running out of
taking
time. And I take the freedom to click on one item, which I think you accentuate more than other thinkers, writers that I've seen. And you mentioned it just now in a couple instances of coming together. You're talking about the connection. And there's one, actually, you specifically teach this now at Harvard. It may be one of your main courses, which is reweaving ourselves. Reweaving ourselves. And what I find very interesting about it is, and you mentioned it just now as one of the key tasks, is yes, there needs to be an inner journey, and you mentioned aspects of it, and we talked about it before, love, that may be the simplifying word around it. And at the same time, you're emphasizing doing it together, bringing people together, the reweaving, the connection is as fundamental. But let me make the question a little bit more difficult for you, not just confirming that it's important, because you quote that at some point after the pandemic, for example, there were collaborative efforts of industries, that cement and steel industry, that actually knew, and I know that the kind of collaboration that Paul Polman tried to build lasted for some time, but it may not have been as successful as he hoped. So the more difficult part of the question is, why is this so important, and what kind of collaboration do you think we need that works? Because people have seen it and tried, not always successful.
So, firstly, we're never going to get to utopia, right? All these kinds of movements will try and will fail, and things will go wrong, and we'll do them again. I mean, any kind of collaboration in the kind of circumstances we live in is going to be fragile. But, they're still alive. The collaboration in steel and cement to try and reduce carbon emissions is still going because there's a group of leaders in both industries that can see that their industries only survive if they find low carbon alternatives. There are collaborations in textiles, in cruise ships, in cocoa growing because people can, we're trying to find our way through to realizing that we have responsibility and an economic interest in the whole system, not just in our own well-being. And those incentives are still in place. And so these collaborations I think, keep on emerging. One of the interesting things I learned in my research for Reimagining Capitalism, and it's in the book, is that business has a really tough time collaborating,
Mm-hmm.
except when they really have to. And so, one of the things that I think we can help, and there's a wonderful question in the chat about, well, this is a great talk, but how would you really turn this into a world moving thing?
Yeah, please
Is-
address it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and I'm assuming that most of us on the call are academics. Ideas matter. Legitimizing ideas matter. But ideas plus examples, I think that's how people learn. And so, one of the things I notice with my students is I'll do diagnosis, they're happy. I'll do like, well, here's the solution. And they go, yeah, I'm happy. And then I'll say, what would you do? And everyone is like, what? That there's a kind of feeling that as an individual, I don't have agency. And so this is kind of what we've been doing, holding up the people who are doing this, showing how it works, supporting the students and the people we work with in finding that quiet place inside them, helping them build peer groups so that they have others they can talk to when things get rough. And really trying to legitimize this as a very different way of thinking about the world. I do think, for what it's worth, that there is a breaking open, that it is really clear that just keeping the existing system going is not a goal that everyone is that keen on. And I think, I don't know who said this, but and my apologies if it was you, the change will only happen if we think we can throw a better party. And I think the good news is there is a better place we can get to that so many people would like to go to. I mean, I never used to say the word love in an academic conversation, ever, ever. I did it for the first time in November at a conference of economists, and I got a standing ovation. And I thought, okay, something is shifting. So,
Let me let me
I
let
think
me
we just
inter
need to walk into that shift. Something is shifting.
Speaking about shift, I want to use the last 2 minutes to use your very privileged position teaching at Harvard, as well as working with so many businesses and CEOs over the last 20 years. How do you translate what you observe, most of your insights, what you get from businesses, into the classroom of students? What gives you hope as you confront the new generation of leaders?
So, I try and teach on three levels. One is cognitive, And so that's all about case studies and, talking about the interaction of love and power and what's wrong. And this is a civilizational crisis. And here's how we could address it. And experiential. So we do deep listening exercises in class. I read poetry. We do body movements. I'm a big fan of many of the techniques developed by the Presencing Institute to build social soil. I think they're doing just extraordinary work. So I'm trying to give students the experience of a group that is grounded and connected in kindness and in love, using all kinds of exercises. And then the third part is I'm trying to help the students acknowledge their despair and their difficulty and really begin to see themselves as actors. And I have
Mhm.
so much to learn on that front. But one part of it is bringing extraordinary visitors into the class through videos or in person. Is what I found in Reimagining Capitalism is the students began to believe me by about the 15th visitor. They're like,
Okay,
okay, maybe you could run a firm this way. And so I may be stuck on the old playbook, but now I'm bringing in people, and I hope the students are beginning to say, oh, I could live my life that way. I could do that.
beautiful.
Yeah.
That's a nice outlook to hear it from the source, working with students. That gives you actually hope that, and I hear the same from our conscious business education project, that many of the students want and long for this kind of change. Rebecca, I know you have a hard stop. Thank you so much. The time was too short to address all the questions, but you did a great job helping us to guide you through your thinking, your wisdom, and your heart. Again, thanks a lot, Rebecca. And thanks for the audience to join us.
Let me thank everyone who's in this room. I know how much work you're doing on the ground. And I think that together, well, who knows if we'll make a difference, but I think we should certainly try. So thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure and delight to be here.
Thank you.
Constance, thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
folks. We'll
Thanks,
have a
everyone.
summer break here
Take
and
care.
we'll see and talk each other again in September, October.